A while to assemble, but I hope that we have our webinar audience on board, and I want to welcome everybody to the now fourth CEADIR series presentation. And in the past, CEADIR, as you know, stands for the Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience. And we have really focused a lot on the financing of a lot of different types of mitigation or adaptation climate actions. And today we're going to bring it back to the sort of economic analysis part of our project, because a lot of financing comes out of doing very good economic assessments and looking as closely at the market or non-market values and figuring out not just the GHG emission reductions that are associated, which is of course what we're talking about if we're talking about any type of climate change action, but we're also looking at it to say, what other secondary livelihood benefits, economic, environmental, and health benefits are maybe associated with some of these actions. So today's talk is about how co-benefits have unlocked climate financing. And the moderator and speaker will be Eric Hyman, who comes from USAID. He's with the Economic Policy Office in the Economic Growth, Education, and Environment Bureau. Our other speaker is Dr. Tulika Narayan, who is from Abt Associates. She's also the senior economist on the CEADIR project, and at Abt she has been working, I think, 10, 15 years on environmental valuation too, so she's very well versed in how you do. She's a resource as well as an agriculture economist too. So with that, I want to start. I just want to remind some people on the webinar that we will be asking polling questions as we usually do. And we're hoping that you will answer those, because after the two speakers have spoken, we'll have a fairly extended Q&A period. And during the Q&A period, what we'd like to do is go through some of the answers. The webinar people, we would like you, I don't believe it's being asked right now, but we would like you to also tell what country you're from so that we can know the sort of geographic diversity that we have right now who's participating. And certainly all of the speeches will be uploaded and the link will be on our page so that you can go back and look at things if you need to, if you come in late, or if you're needing to go back and want to look at some of the points and references too. So with that, we'll just go on to the next slide. I basically said, again, we're going to be having Eric doing the overview, and it's looking at it sort of from the perspective of how are co-benefits leading to climate actions and when you value those. And Tulika will then be going into case studies. Some of the case studies have come from a variety of donors, which we'll be mentioning and giving attribution to. But I think it's really important that these are ongoing activities. We've used a few examples. There's many more. Our project CEADIR is right now in Colombia, and we've been talking with people about helping on co-benefit analysis of a Upper Magdalena and the Huila Basin area, where we'd gone in before under an earlier project for USAID, and we may be going back and helping to take some of the methodologies for environmental valuations where there's real trade-offs in development between gold mining and or protection of the watersheds as far as water quality, as well as environmental preservation too. So with that, as you can see, Eric is our co-activity manager for the CEADIR project. He will be the COR for the project in the future. And he's had many years, over 30 years experience as an economist. And he's been also working with the U.S. African Development Foundation, the Enterprise Worldwide Foundation, and then, of course, he's worked with the Office of Technology Assessment.
Thank you, Marcy.
There you go.
We all know that climate change politics and economics are a very difficult problem, and here are some of the reasons why. So in economics, we have a term called externalities, and this refers to any unintended, uncompensated spillover effects of human activity on others and the environment. And that's basically what we're talking about with climate change emissions. Also, they lead to long-term and irreversible problems. The emissions are dispersed, but the impacts are global. And because of this, there's no natural market that can develop for greenhouse gas emissions, so you need to have public intervention. There's also a lot of uncertainty about what the global effects are, and then even more when you translate those down into national and local effects. And this makes incentives for coordination and action unclear. There are a lot of high transaction costs for coordination. And then there's what economists call a free rider problem, which means since if one country takes action, it benefits everyone. There's an incentive to kind of let the next guy do it because there are costs involved if you do take action. And then there's a lot of uncertainty as well about what the costs of the solutions are, and there's technological change that's occurring very rapidly, which will change those costs as well. So how do you deal with externalities? So the classic approach is named after an economist named PigOV. And so we call this the PigOvian option, and this is to use taxes or subsidies to change incentives. So if something imposes external negative costs, you want to tax it to get less of it produced. Or you want to subsidize equivalently the people to avoid producing it by using better technologies. So these try to change the social welfare outcomes from the failure of the perfectly competitive market assumptions. And then the next approach is a public regulation approach. So you have laws or regulations to prevent or repair the social welfare outcomes. Now there's a third approach, which as you know, I'm filling in today for Dr. William Ward for USAID, from USAID, and he's working on a new theory of public intervention, which is to develop tools and cost-benefit analysis to, rather than patch up the outcomes relating from market failures and externalities, to try to fix the causes in a more direct way. So he's been working on some theoretical papers, and then we'll develop this further with some more applied tools. So you can contact WARD at usaid.gov to keep informed of those papers. So looking at some of the approaches to market intervention. So the PigOvian interventions, as we mentioned before, they deal with trying to address those missing or incomplete markets that result in the global externalities. And the new theory of public intervention that Bill is working on are trying to deal with the institutional failures and the transaction costs of creating a market. And you see some of those issues also in the broad policy questions of whether we do carbon taxes or whether we do cap and trade like market mechanisms with tradable emission rights, et cetera. Then the other approach is to focus on the co-benefits, and there's increasing attention to this now. And particularly, you may have read in the newspapers not too long ago about the new proposed coal power plant regulations in the United States to reduce carbon emissions, but that under the required cost-benefit analyses that the U.S. government has to do for major regulations, a lot of this intervention will be justified based on the reduction in air pollution, which has significant health benefits that can be valued in monetary terms. So the co-benefits approach is trying to identify and value other motivations for action besides the direct greenhouse gas reductions. And also identify who those beneficiaries are and the incentives and the disincentives that affect those potential stakeholders to try to generate political support as well. So here are some of the potential co-benefits: health, water quality, jobs, particularly if you're using new technologies for energy efficiency or energy production, incomes, habitats and biodiversity, and better transport. And some examples. Tulika will be talking about one example in transport, but you have the passenger and cargo time savings, and you can value that based on the opportunity cost of labor time. You have decreased fuel use from less traffic congestion, less wear and tear on vehicles in that stop-and-go traffic, and as well as the reduced emissions of particulates and noxious gases. You have energy savings, then sustainable landscapes. You have improved agricultural, forest product, and fishery yields. Other ecosystem services, which might include water quality maintenance, sanitation, flood control, coastal zone protection, for example, from mangroves along the coast. And health, of course, both respiratory illnesses being a big part of that, and then another effect is vector-borne diseases, which may otherwise increase with climate change. So then how do you analyze co-benefits? So there are a couple of different ways. So the first approach is cost-effectiveness analysis. So this is when you know the costs of the mitigation method, and you can estimate how much mitigation you get, but it's difficult to value the benefits in monetary terms, even though there's consensus that they're desirable. So you can say the cost per unit reduction in child mortality, or the cost per quality adjusted life year gained. The cost benefit analysis approach takes that one step further because you are actually replacing dollar values on the benefits. And in many cases, these techniques are imperfect. They give you very much lower bound estimates, not really the full estimates, but oftentimes those lower bound estimates are all you need to demonstrate that a different policy decision or investment should be done when you take them into account, rather than ignoring them, which basically gives them all a value of 0. And then there's another approach where the US government has taken, which is to try to calculate kind of a macro level estimate of the global social cost of carbon. And this has been done at 4 different discount rates, because it's based on net present values of long-term future streams of benefits and costs. And the most commonly used value is about $40 among the 4 different values that the US government is proposing there. And so it's very legitimate in US government economic analyses to include that cost as you evaluate the benefits of mitigating the carbon reductions. And as you know, there are many different greenhouse gases, and so some have longer term effects, some have more potent effects than carbon, so we calculate all of them in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Then another approach that's commonly used is marginal abatement cost curves, and this is kind of like a combination of cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis, because you use the cost effectiveness analysis for the greenhouse gas reductions, and then you use cost benefit analysis to either fully or partially offset some of those costs with the co-benefits that you can value. And we'll be showing you some examples of that later on in this presentation. So as you define interventions for co-benefits, this can be done for strategic planning. You can switch your emphasis from these primary greenhouse gas benefits to the co-benefits. You may be able to get different constituencies involved in supporting the programs, and program and project analysis. Use cost-benefit analysis where it's possible. And project design, take advantage of existing policies and fundings for the co-benefits. So there may be particular financing sources available that deal with biodiversity, for example, that deal with air pollution and health, that you may be able to recruit and support climate mitigation approaches that have these co-benefits. And then in financing, you can attract these specialized sources. So here's an example, and it's a bit small, but this is an example of a marginal abatement cost curve, and this is from the New Climate Economy Report of 2014, which was led by a consortium with primarily the World Resources Institute. And they updated some earlier MAC curves that you might have seen that McKinsey and the World Bank had done in earlier years. But what I particularly like about this format, which differs from the others, is it explicitly shows you not just the net effect of the costs of the carbon mitigation offset by the co-benefits, but it shows you explicitly what the carbon mitigation costs are and what the co-benefits are. So in blue, you see the original abatement cost curves, which are only focusing on the costs of the carbon mitigation. In red, you can see the benefit curve when you account for the co-benefit savings as well as the mitigation costs. So now there's a zero line here, and you can see that some of these interventions are above the line, some are below the line. So the ones that are above the line actually are net benefits. And these are calculated with discounting, so they're net present value estimates. And the ones below the line are net costs. So of course, you ideally want to choose the ones with net benefits first. But there's another important factor involved here, which is the width of these rectangles. That shows how much carbon you can mitigate when you choose that particular option. And then something else to take into consideration is sometimes you would think that these that have the very high co-benefits are the low-hanging fruit. And as Bill Ward often says, sometimes that low-hanging fruit holds on very tight for a reason. There may be legal or institutional factors, and there may be externalities where the economic and social benefits differ from the financial benefits. So there may be barriers that are preventing these things from happening, or there may be high transaction costs. So just if we look at a couple of these, you can see the ones that have that are at the very far left-hand part without significant co-benefits here, and then you can see that where co-benefits add above them. Then you can also see some options down here that are highly negative, such as adding carbon capture and sequestration technologies, which are basically not quite there yet for coal power plants. But there's some surprises here. Now, this is a global estimate, and so, of course, in any particular country, this could be quite different. But one of the surprises here is that reforestation of degraded lands here is rather costly. It's in the net cost side. But the co-benefits basically bring it up to about a zero cost level. All right, so I'll turn this over to Tulika now.
Thanks a lot, Eric. So Eric, as you started out, talked about three ways of sort of getting to reducing greenhouse gases. One was the PigOV taxes, government's own regulatory control. One of the pivotal key things about those two actions is that it requires government action. It requires, and it's not politically very favorable to increase taxes or put regulations. And carbon externality is at the global level. It sort of is above the nations itself. So that creates a specific challenge. And you mentioned the new theory, which is getting at addressing the market failure. And really, in the space that we work in, donors or analysts, these are the areas in which we can sort of come in and sort of look at how action is possible or how climate financing can be leveraged, because government action is harder to come about. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present 3 case studies, which will walk you through various types of co-benefits that we can calculate around projects that will lead to reduction in greenhouse gases. And the interesting thing that you will see, I'll walk you through situations where the largest co-benefit comes from, again, areas where there is still an externality associated with it. And then a second case where there's not so much of an externality. People, the stakeholders who benefit from the co-benefits are well defined, they're well known, but there are still limits to how that gains can be actually materialized, and therefore there can be some impediment. And in the third case, when it accrues directly to a specific entity, and it's easy to make action. So let's walk through some of those case studies. A couple of those case studies I was involved in, working with colleagues in Abt Associates. And there's another one which I was not involved in, but was done by a colleague of mine, several colleagues of mine. So the first one, let me take you to Indonesia. Indonesia in the Jambi province. This is the yellow district over there. Overall, this is part of a very large Millennium Challenge Corporation grant. It's about 300 million plus activity around green prosperity, as the name suggests, trying to get to reducing carbon emissions while getting growth to the local economies and otherwise. And they were looking at bringing in climate financing from the private sector and sort of boosting that by providing some co-financing from the donor itself. And the idea was, well, before to do this, it's really important. So as policy analysts, we came in and said it's really important for us to come and look at all the different co-benefits around reducing these GHG gases, understanding where those co-benefits go, which stakeholders actually accrue those benefits, and also understanding if there are winners and losers, because if the winners are people who have low bargaining position in an economy, in a local political context, then again you have a problem. So fully understanding that is very important. So first of all, to determine the potential for low emission investments, and then the GP would say once they fully understand the market failure, once they fully understand what's causing carbon emissions, inviting funds and proposals to invest in that. I'll walk you through that, although that picture will become clearer as I walk through it. So as Eric, you mentioned, trying to identify the market failures and addressing it at the root cause was one of the key things that we tried to do. And then essentially, the part that I will not talk through in too much detail is ultimately we also looked at a lot of low emissions options, crafted out the various reductions that would be possible, which would lead to then further investments. So as a starting point, our study was focused in the Moro Jambi district, which has a lot of peatland forests. As a starting point, what we did was to look at all the various land uses that are there in the district and understanding in each of those land uses, what are the financial returns that accrue to stakeholders and to whom. Financial returns mean actual money coming into people's pockets or actual livelihoods coming into people's sustenance. And then we compared it to the economic returns to land. So when you now take into account all the social benefits, whether it's from mitigation, reduction of carbon emissions, or whether it's the ecosystem services provided by it, or whether it's the Sumatran tigers that are housed in that ecosystem, and essentially then comparing what the disparities are between the two, which will explain how deforestation actually occurs in the region. So Moro Jambi, as I mentioned, basically has the Burback National Forest. It is a designated wetland by Indonesia. It has 110 hectares of protected peat forest. Now, peat forests are very unique in that they have very large carbon stock as compared to a natural forest, about 200 tons per hectare of carbon storage. An interesting thing to point out, what I call the 60,000 hectares of Tahura. Tahura is essentially the area surrounding the protected forest. So it is not protected through regulations by the country. And so these are the areas which are most prone to degradation because they are in the surrounding area, but they still have pretty high peatland forests. Then looking at the entire area, and you'll soon see a picture, there is dryland agriculture occurring there. There is oil palm plantations. Now you look at oil palm plantations, perhaps the highest yielding per hectare investment that you can make. So it's huge, huge financial returns coming from these users. And there's also wetland agriculture, which is suitable for rice that's occurring. So let's take a peek at the picture. So on the right, extreme right to the east, the green area is basically the Burback National Forest, huge peatland forest. And as the yellow areas that you see, the yellow boxes, these are palm oil plantation permits, which means land areas that have not yet converted to palm oil, but they have permits there and those areas can be converted. And the deep brown one are the ones that have palm plantations already. So we looked at various uses. So we had these protected forests. We have what's called production forests. Production forests are the forests from which the community is allowed to, reap non-timber forests and get some financial returns from. There's all these agricultural land, and there is poem plum plantation. So let's look at what the picture looks like. Impacts. In the short run, you do get returns from the logging and so forth, but in the long run, you lose a lot from tourism, commerce, and very importantly for this region, a degradation of the hydrologic function that it provides. So peatland forests essentially have a lot of water in them, and that water is providing a lot of the underground water systems that are used to cultivate rice and other plantations, even the oil palm plantations. But that sort of cost comes about only far out in the future. So, with people having high discount rate, that is not considered. And at the same time, the district has about 40% of peatland, so very high carbon value for us. So now let's look at how we did the financial returns to the various stakeholders. So if you look at the forest area that exists right now, the protected forest, the tourism fees is one obvious way that you get returns from it. Now, one of the challenges of, as Eric was pointing out, of challenges of trying to value or these forests, and typically you use the travel cost approaches to figure out what the valuation is. But Burbank Forest is not a very friendly forest. It's swampy, it's got mosquitoes. It's not the kind of place that, you want to go for tourism. What's that? Unless you're a bird watcher and really ardent. So at any rate, there are some visitors over there. So we picked up some of that. And there is around in what I call the Tahura, there is some timber that is being drawn out, and there's non-timber forest that is going on. We, of course, in our valuation only looked at legal extraction. And then for all of the other uses, we were able to take information from the country's own statistic books to understand what returns are to oil palm plantation, rubber plantation, rice, corn, and essentially we calculated the financial returns, and they had much higher financial returns, not surprisingly, as compared to the forest at the 10% discount rate. What are the economic returns to land? Now, if you look at the forest, it has, benefits from ecosystem regulation of climate. It sequesters carbon, as I said, is very high. And then there are hydrological processes and hydrological function that it provides to the stakeholders who directly accrue it, but they do not recognize it. And then there are non-use values, which is essentially providing, the ecosystem to sustain the Sumatran tigers, who are critically endangered. Then there is existence value and so on and so forth. And then the red areas are the one that we were able to actually monetize based on benefits transfer. And then for carbon sequestration, we use the social cost of carbon that Eric was referring to. And here's the picture that we get. So look at the left-hand side. The left-hand side panel is financial returns. To the east right corner, all the light areas. So deep red is essentially high returns and light is low returns. You can see that when you look at the financial picture, we don't care about forests, right? And then if you go to the right, when we take into account the economic returns, and I want to say that we were very fair to oil palm plantations and rubber plantations. We took into account the fact that they also sequester carbon. So we did do that. And we also took into account the fact that oil plantation, their waste leads to methane emissions. So we did account for that. So net of the sequestration value that plantations provide with the peatland loss, they are still a social cost to us. And so this is the kind of picture that we presented to the provincial heads of the district. And one of the reasons I would also want to point out, which has led to higher deforestation in Indonesia, is that the decentralization has meant that provincial offices can decide who gets the permit for what purposes. And you can see oil is so, gives so much money that those conversions have been at a higher rate. So now, so we've understood so far there are a couple of things that have come about. First of all, there are these benefits that do not accrue to the people, local people, not even probably the nation. It's globally accruing. So if you look at the protected forest, the purple area on the left, the lower left circle, most of the protected forests real benefits go to global interests. So provincial government or national governments would not normally have any incentive to protect it. Production forest, there is some amount of community returns coming from it directly. So you would expect that there would be some sustainability there. But palm plantation, again, accrues to the community, it accrues to the government, and it accrues to the private company. The private company is a very strong political player normally. And so you get the picture. So the problem is also who accrues these benefits. That's one piece of it. And one of the things that the hydrological process, for example, where the community directly benefits, but they don't realize it. So even though it's there, we did not value it, so that is not showing up in this pie, but it's something to keep in back of the mind in terms of what causes the market failure. So here I summarize basically that failure to consider the co-benefits will lead to deforestation, hydrological benefits of peat not recognized by smallholder. Maybe you could do awareness campaigns, future production value of forests is discounted, and indirect use value of forests and peatland accrue globally and nationally. So it is difficult to leverage, in this instance, there's a lot of the co-benefits are themselves an externality, or it's accruing unequally among stakeholders. So what do you do? So actually, MCC's Green Prosperity Program, I believe, is a pretty innovative way of approaching climate financing. What it is coming with is a pretty large bucket of money, but they're saying that we will release this bucket of money only if stakeholders who are engaged in this, directly engaging with this resource, come up with proposal that will reduce the GHG emissions and at the same time also lead to employment and growth in that region. And should you bring that proposal, we will match that proposal with financing. So it sort of flips the story around and basically welcomes the private sector to participate in it, including the oil palm plantations. So the oil palm plantations can come up with proposals. Of course, there are also some global actions going on around making oil palm more sustainable and using companies to become more green. But within this context, it's very innovative how to unlock climate financing. By bringing in a little bit of money yourself, you're actually inviting investments from private sectors. And this was one of the examples that I mentioned. There are many more in renewable energy and cocoa and coffee that are within MCC's purview. I wanted to make one point before I move on to the other example. And it's kind of an important point to make. Let me just go back for a second to this picture. I wanted to say that as an analyst, we have to remember something which is very important, what Eric mentioned, about when we use cost-effective analysis because it's hard to monetize. This was an easy picture for us to flip because we were working with a peatland forest. We did the same analysis in another district, Mamasa district, where we were talking about usual regular forests, not peatland forests. And when you start comparing it with oil palm plantations, even with accounting for carbon sequestration and other value, your picture still doesn't change. And then you get back to the question of how much do I value forests? And therefore, it's important to then sort of say, okay, for every hectare of forest saved, here are the costs and so on and so forth, because it's important to realize that the existing value could be much larger than what you can account for. Even though we would value it by social cost of carbon, there are so many other benefits that we don't account for. Something to really keep in mind, because these are things that we will run into as we support analysis. So now, going from a slightly more complex case with a fairly innovative approach to handle it, let's go to a situation where we can define the stakeholders who can benefit from the co-benefits. So in Vietnam, going not too far out, going to Vietnam, well, let's talk about the case study we did for low emissions rice. This was work that we did for Eric for analysis of under the project called Analysis for Investments for Low Economic Growth, or ALEG. So why do we care about rice? We care about rice in the context of carbon mitigation because rice fields typically are grown through flooding. And now flooding causes methane emissions. Methane has a pretty high carbon equivalence, and it's been upgraded. I think I shouldn't say upgraded because now compared to AR4 to AR5 now, they are supposed to have 40% more emissions per the new calculation. So it's about 35 tons equivalent to carbon. In addition, of course, like any other agriculture, it uses nitrogen fertilizer, which causes nitrous oxide emissions, which has again a very high global emissions value. And there are several rice cultivation practices that reduce GHG emissions. They are reduced use of nitrogen fertilizer, then short duration variety of rice because it crunches the time that the fields are flooded in. There's a little bit of a trade-off because in that short time it also has to grow very intensely, so that means it uses a little bit more nitrogen. So you have to be very accurate in how you adopt it to reduce the carbon emissions. And then the very big one, which is being promoted heavily, is called alternate wetting and drying, which is trying to essentially reduce the time that the rice is flooded so that the methane emissions can reduce. And so how can co-benefits be unlocked from these approaches? There are a few more, and I'm mentioning the ones that were specific to Vietnam, and in our discussion we can talk more about it. So very nicely, it sort of stacks up quite nicely because the co-benefits from each of those practices accrue to the smallholders. You know, if you use less nitrogen, you're going to pay less for it, as long as that is yield neutral, which it is. It has been shown in several studies. It reduces your production costs. If you have improved, if all of those other entities also can either be yield neutral or yield increasing, which means that these should be technologies that farmers should readily adopt. And the government of Vietnam is actually promoting these technologies within, its provinces, particularly in the south. And what we did was taking advantage of the fact that some of this work is already ongoing, and there is actually an impetus to get towards green growth in agriculture, pretty heavy impetus, because rice is a big contributor of emissions in Vietnam. We actually went and conducted a survey to find out what actually people's actual costs are from all of these technologies. Now, this is a marginal abatement cost curve, and I use the things below are actually nicer for my graph because it's a cost, and what Eric showed you was a benefit. So this is just flipping the picture. So which means, what does it show you? That actually what we hypothesize, that low nitrogen and short duration variety will actually be cost reducing. That's indeed the case. It's right here down below the left two rectangles. And low nitrogen has a fairly decent carbon abatement potential also. And not surprisingly, a lot of people are adopting it. So when we looked at our survey, a very large number of farmers are adopting it. So there's actually very little margin of further improvement for that reason. So it is a low-hanging fruit that did not hang on tight. Okay, but the low-hanging fruit that has hung on tight, because many studies had shown that alternate wetting and drying is yield improving, or basically increasing profit, we found that that's actually not the case. That as applied by people on the ground, it's costly, and it is not actually yield improving or net profit improving. And it is, we also did a fair amount of qualitative investigation to understand what is going on. It's a very complex technology. You do this at this time, and you drain it, and then you add more water, and then you have to weed more. So it's a little bit complex to really adopt, and very interesting that there were farmers who told us that they were doing it, and then we looked at their practices and they were not. So it's a little bit hard to sort of convey it. So that's important for us to understand as policymakers, what are the constraints in adoption and how can we get to that. So there's something called a behavioral change constraint also in this particular case.
There was another very interesting work about this study. They found very different results in different regions of Vietnam in terms of the costs and benefits. So again, that location-specific information is very important.
And the other thing that I would also emphasize as we do more analysis to, fix this externality is actually there's a lot more data than you would think there is. There was a fair amount of data available. Government of Vietnam is collecting large amounts of data, and it was just a matter of adding a few questions, and you could get all this information on a continuous basis to be able to tailor your approaches to different regions. And that was one of the things we did in that activity, to look at what's already been collected and just add a few questions. And we just built the questionnaire from already existing questionnaire. So thanks for that point, Eric. That was a very important one. So how do we unlock climate financing the situation? Well, some of stuff gets readily adopted on its own. That was a sweet spot. Where it is not a sweet spot, there's several things one can do, and I do know that I'm giving you one example here, which I'll talk briefly about, but there has been a lot of donor interest, a lot of donor or public financing around alternate wetting and drying, and USDA is spending some resources and increasing of simplifying how the technology is communicated to smallholders. We are involved in a very interesting approach called AgResults Innovation, Research and Delivery. This is a multi-donor funded project. USAID is a partner, USAID, DFID, Gates, Australians, Canadians. They are essentially trying this results-based incentive to improve low emissions rice technologies adoption. So it's essentially saying that, first of all, I'll give you a prize if you come up with a technology that reduces rice emissions and increases yields. And I will also give you a prize for every smallholder who adopts it. But I'll give you the prize only when that happens. So I'll spend money only in that instance. So there are two pieces of puzzle that it's trying to solve. One is that if the technology exists, how can I make farmers adopt it? And secondly, also to engender more technologies in this realm. So that's an interesting way of sort of, again, because the entities who come in and come forward have to bring some financing with them. They have to finance their, their ideas, and then they'll get the money at the end. So that's a very innovative way of bringing in, again, resources from private sector, from other entities. And in some instances, even the public sector may join hands with private sector. They don't care. There is also a potential for tapping into green markets. It's very interesting, the development of these kinds of pilots. People go in different directions. Who to incentivize? One of the people to incentivize was potentially the importers. Is there a demand for green rice in this world? Will that sort of motivate people to come in and say, I'm going to work with smallholders, I'm going to make them adopt low emissions rice, and I'm going to market it. Recognizing the fact that one of the biggest impediments could be behavior change. Now going to perhaps a slightly simpler case, which I think, Eric, you mentioned the transportation projects, which, essentially, this is a work that again happened under ALEG, Anna Balova and they did not. It was ADB, right? It was done for Asian Development Bank, and Sue Greco and Anna Balova worked on it. So it was the idea that the Greater Dhaka Sustainable Urban Transportation Corridor project was looking to invest in a public transportation project. And the question was, are there other co-benefits which could help tip over the decision to go ahead with this project, or maybe attract financing so that the project would move forward because it had so many GHG benefits, mitigation benefits. What are the co-benefits of transportation? Reduced congestion and time saving for passengers, you could argue, is the primary reason why these projects are even considered, right? And they can be improved mobility, leading to increased productivity, growth of the local economy, and reduced air pollution benefits, air pollution for health benefits. So transportation projects can often be in that sweet spot because people want it for those two reasons. That affects their bottom line. It's in the interest of the cities. It's in the interest of of the economy. It is also, I think, has a nice image if you have a good public transportation system. There are many other benefits you can think about. So what we did in the study was to look at the air pollution health benefits. And essentially, these are the sort of projections of the reduced air pollutant emissions, and these are the reductions in GHG emissions. In this particular case, the health benefit itself was not large enough to tip the balance between the two. But that is not to say that it cannot happen in other cases. If you look at places like China, where there's such heavy pollution burden, it's very possible that will help you switch. But I would remind us that if you look at transportation project as a GHG mitigation project, then the primary co-benefit that could tip the balance is simply the returns that you get from increase productivity, reduce travel time, and those things can just propel the projects to go forward, and we can think of getting more climate financing to help move it forward, whether it's because of health benefits or not. Just a very quick slide on the global burden of disease. This is a paper that came out in Lancet, just to point out that if you look at, let's see, 7th row down the, you see the ambient particulate matter pollution is pretty high in terms of the global burden of disease. So which means, again, that there is a fair amount of health benefit to be had from projects that reduce these pollutants, including the transportation projects.
And if you look at Asia alone, it was up to number 6.
Yeah, and that's not surprisingly. I mean, China and India are choking, as I can. So in summary, sometimes local co-benefits can sometimes help them make case for financing quite readily, quite easily. I think the Bangladesh project has gone through. Sometimes it can accrue more directly, but smallholders could have weak bargaining power, or they may have information constraint to really recognize those benefits. In the case of Vietnam, when they're not sort of taking into account the full benefits of the technologies, they may not adopt it. And sometimes the co-benefits are actually externalities themselves, in which case you'll have to get more innovative, try payment for environmental services, or some of the approaches that Millennium Challenge Corporation is using could be tried. In any case, the point is to flip the picture and see, well, where are the largest benefits? Can I use that as a way to motivate climate financing? I think a large green carbon fund,
that $10 billion fund that the U.S. will be contributing about 30% of that will be getting underway soon.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I showed you that there are some references at the back should you be interested in some of the papers that we talked about. But I can go back to the next slide. Okay, and we welcome questions now.
Okay, now we're going to move to the question and answer period. And I'm just going to step up here. I think Eric did mention, and I just wanted to highlight again that Bill Ward unfortunately couldn't join us. For those on the webinar and those in the audience, this is not Bill Ward, this is Eric, obviously. But he had a family, Bill had a family emergency, and so our best wishes go out to him that everything goes well there, too. The CEADIR project is about assisting on conducting climate change economic analysis and looking for the sweet spot, as I said, for investing in mitigation and adaptation. As it is, we therefore can help and support on adaptation, clean energy, sustainable landscape. What we heard today were co-benefits mostly from the mitigation side, but then if you look actually at the Indonesia case, there are some sustainable landscape implications, very significant sustainable landscape implications there, plus also actually adaptation implications. And in other future topics, we'll be talking more in depth about adaptation and financing for adaptation. But I wanted to highlight just a little bit about who our audience is and who we're here, who's attending on the webinar. And the question that we posed in our polling was that we asked if people are involved right now in climate change co-benefit assessment. And about 36% said yes, 50% said no, and the other one said it's not applicable to what they do. So that's quite interesting. A fair amount of people have logged on and are interested because this actually applies to their work and what they will be doing for various different companies or organizations. The types of work that they are working on is there's a fair amount of research, basic research going on. There's also some for academic purposes. Plus there's also a fair amount of RED and adaptation co-benefits in the audience that's listening to us. So I think that's useful to know too, because obviously that's an area of RED and adaptation where co-benefits are incredibly important. As Tulika was saying, in the case of Indonesia and Sumatra, the benefits flipped and the total economic or social opportunity costs when you add in the economic value of those forest lands really were much more positive than the financing side, but a lot of that had to do because it was peatlands. When you look at another district in Indonesia, it didn't flip as much. So part of the adaptation in the RED analysis is what do we do with those lands where it may not flip and you can't make the co-benefit assessment, but you feel that there's just significant importance, existence values, there's other types of, I would say, longer term or different type of temporal effects, and you want to capture those. So you may come in with some, it could be USAID programs, it could be donor programs, it can be national government programs to protect those forests, to conserve those forest lands. Then the third question we asked, has the co-benefit analysis that you're involved in, i.e. the people in the webinar, has it led to increased climate financing? And there were at least two interesting reasons. One was it talked about the purchase of the verified emission reduction, that these co-benefits were particularly important to some type of, I don't know whether it was, I assume it's a voluntary carbon market or credit market that they were working in. And that set of co-benefits helped tip the balance for investors. Then another area that somebody else mentioned was the socio-bosque RED programs, and they mentioned that in Ecuador, those co-benefits were of particular interest and of importance to the financiers that came in. And finally, I just wanted to say some of the people that are participating are from the U.S. There's also folks from the Philippines and the Dominican Republic, and it's throughout the U.S., the East Coast and West Coast too. So let me just start this off. We've got a fair amount of questions, and those of you on the webinar, please send in any questions that you might have. We will be bringing those up and asking those of Tulika and Eric. But I always like to start off with two sets of questions. One, a question in which the speakers get to ask each other something, and I take my prerogative also of asking speakers one question. So I'll start off with Tulika, because you finished up. Mm-hmm. And what I'd like to say is you mentioned a bit about where these programs are headed and how they're going, but can you give us a little bit more information about some of the organizations behind those and why these types of analyses were important to them, and highlight the difference between some of the local, what was happening particularly in Indonesia at the local level, and in like Dhaka, in which the Asian Development Bank was giving a loan for the BRT, the Rapid Bus Transit.
Okay, thanks, Marcy. Thanks for asking that question. Actually, in the case of the Indonesia project, our analysis was helpful in understanding the market failures and the areas. We actually conducted a full analysis of possible options to address these problems. And at this stage right now, I believe some of the financing proposals have come in, and they're looking at a pretty large amount of investments to co-finance. I think there's a pretty large one from Mars, which is not in this area, but it's related to cocoa cultivation. And I would like to sort of expand a little bit on the point that you made, Marcy, to explain that investment and how that addresses the problem of the forest of the type like Mamasa, where we just talked about how the economic returns are not flipping the picture quite as much. What can we do there? In those instances, the kind of proposals that we encouraged were to increase the returns to agriculture on the intensive margin, so that people do not try and expand on the extensive margin and cut forests. So a lot of these proposals were related to encouraging private sector to team up with smallholders and improve their productivity, whether it's cocoa or coffee, which sort of can bring in actors like Mars who are interested in those elements. So actually one of the big areas where the co-financing will go will be to Mars. Potentially to Mars, I shouldn't say that it's going there, but so MCC at this stage is looking and has received a fair amount of proposals which will go forward. On the Bangladesh one, since I was not heavily involved in it, I do not know the full details of where it is headed, but I do know that it has been funded at this point, and I think the loan would be instrumental in doing that, an example of sort of bringing in banks like ADB, which are non-commercial banks, to help mobilize action. In the case of Vietnam, there are several things going on. There's a fair amount of effort from the government side. Our study was very helpful in understanding that the behavioral constraints are key. So the USDA's project to help increase the awareness campaign and to sort of be very streamlined in explaining what the technology is potentially going to be helpful. And the Ag Results program is going to get started within 3-4 months or 6 months maybe. And so we will see how what kind of proposals come in from that. That'll be very interesting because it'll be open to all actors and who can bring in money into solving that problem. So within about a year or so, things will start moving, Marcy.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Now I'm going to turn to Eric, and from the perspective of USAID, when you see these types of analyses coming in, what is USAID doing right now to off these projects to sort of really get out the knowledge dissemination, but also to help design new projects going forward too?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're funding the CEADIR project, because actually there haven't been an overwhelming number of analyses of exactly what the co-benefits are. A lot of times they're discussed. They're sometimes quantified in physical terms, but not economic terms. And so we're very interested in increasing the state of analysis and decision making. Because USAID doesn't necessarily have huge amounts of funding itself, so we want to try to be more influential in convincing others, attracting private sector funding, working together with other donors as well. And there's also methodological work that needs to be done in this area as well. We have heard that the UK DFID is experimenting with some indicators for co-benefits relating to its programs, and USAID is also looking into the possibility of adding indicators for co-benefits too.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier, the DFID does have a livelihood co-benefit indicator, which is trying to ask for most of its project, not only climate change, but other projects, such as will be comparable to our Feed the Future programs and the farm programs, food security programs. They do look at co-benefit, but in discussing with some USAID folks most recently who do the M&E, they admit fully well, DFID, that it is a difficult indicator to standardize and to get methodologies across all your projects where you're actually having apples to apples versus apples and oranges and tangerines and papayas and mangoes, et cetera, like that coming in too. So again, obviously there's more work to be done, but what's interesting also I'd like to throw out is that I've been involved, and some of the Crown Agents folks have certainly been involved in, and Alan Miller, who's sitting here too as on our CEADIR project with the climate financing and the International Finance Corporation, have been involved in looking at what investments by impact investors are going forward. And a lot of impact investors, which is tapping into the private sector, be they pension funds, be they just socially responsible investors, are looking for these co-benefits. They're not it's not that they don't want to invest in carbon, but they really see these as bringing significant added value to any type of investments they make when they have these particularly livelihoods, or in some cases like RED projects where they have community development, reforestation benefits as well too. So one more set of questions in which I'll have both of you ask a question to each other, and then let's open it up for discussions to the audience here, but also to the folks on the webinar.
Okay, I want to make one comment first, which is that the U.S. government is also participating in a public-private alliance called Tropical Forest Alliance 2020, where we're trying to convince large multinational companies to take voluntary actions to ensure no net deforestation in their supply chains in 4 key sectors, one of which is palm oil, the others are soy, pulp and paper, and also dairy and beef cattle. My question for Tulika is, if you could, the land tenure situation was in the Sumatra case, was this public land, individually owned land, or uncertain tenure, and what was the government's, both the national government and the provincial government's reaction when they're shown data that in the peat lands, although the palm oil production was very profitable for individuals, it was very costly to the country?
Thanks for that question. I'm glad you raised that because there was a very important component of this project which was related to spatial planning. And one of the key threats related to deforestation was identified actually as uncertain boundaries, uncertain understanding of who owns the land was very much a part of the problem. So one of the other core pieces of this assessment was actually to map out these areas and understand where these boundaries are, where uncertain land holdings occur. And this entire case study that we presented was part of an environmental strategic assessment, which also essentially identified specific areas where the oil palm permits, for example, are laid out. However, the community thinks it's their land. And again, this kind of areas where you could sort of leverage an action and define the boundaries better. So to answer your question specifically about who actually owns it, there's some amount of uncertainty, but there's some amount of certainty too about some permits that are belonging to the oil companies. In terms of the reaction of the provincial directors, I think that the selection of the districts where MCC started working out came out of a fair amount of conversation, dialogue, and buy-in through the provincial directors. So it definitely was a situation where there was a willingness to move towards this green growth starting out. So some amount of that buy-in and work had already been done initially. But the maps were a pretty big piece of conversation just to visually see where the ownership are, what the land uses are, and how it opens. I think it was easier to have that conversation with that picture in front of us, undoubtedly. And that was very helpful to sort of convey the importance of protecting these lands and so forth.
Okay.
Oh, and a question for you.
Yes.
Actually, I had a question for you on your graphic too, Eric. You had this marginal abatement cost curve with CoBenefits set up, the new climate economy one. And I was just wondering to what extent is that a marginal abatement cost curve driving USAID's own investments or own actions around this area? Is that sort of something which is fundamental to your decision-making process?
Well, I think the global marginal abatement cost curves aren't really useful for driving investment. They're kind of useful for kind of understanding the situation and then knowing where to look in particular countries. One of the things that the CEADIR project will be doing is producing marginal abatement cost curves for particular countries or even in particular sectors as well that will be actionable for investment purposes.
So it's more like a broad guide map, but not in each. And as we discussed, I guess you were saying that it's very important to do the specific marginal abatement cost curves. Otherwise, you might be in a completely different scenario for a specific context.
Right.
Thanks.
Okay.
I guess we open up to the floor.
Okay, I think we open up to the floor. I'll be having Joan and Leah. Leah will be passing around the mic, for folks here in the audience. And I'm not sure, do you have your first question teed up?
Actually, we have a number of questions from our online audience, but I wanted to open it up to the room and find out if anybody would like to ask something when we get started.
Okay. And please introduce yourself. Say, how you, I know Mark, but just say how, what you're doing with CoBenefits too. I think that'd be very useful to the audience as well as folks on the webinar to know other stories and other actions that are going on out there.
Hello, I'm Mark Wagner from ICF International, and I've been working on climate change issues related to a number of international and domestic U.S. policies for many years. And recently we've been doing a lot of evaluations of climate investment opportunities. And one of the things that I would like to sort of understand is related to complexity. You have multiple donors that are looking at things, bilateral and multilateral institutions. You have multi-sectoral things going on. I think more recently you've started to sort of try to incorporate co-benefits, but traditionally the way of reporting has been very difficult, and so it's sort of reduced some traction, I think. Then you also have the need to develop institutional capacity in countries, and then try to layer in these sort of biodiversity or land degradation co-benefits, and then you have multiple reporting that you need to do if you're getting support from USAID and the GEF and the Climate Investment Funds and Millennium Challenge Corporation, and now you're bringing in the private sector. And in our new climate architecture moving forward, maybe some of that complexity can become streamlined or harmonized, but it seems like it's sort of going in the other direction, which is more complexity. So I'd like the panelists to try to address that issue related to complexity and how to, moving forward, to make it easier as opposed to more complex.
Well, yeah, we definitely see the same trends where there's going to be increasing donor collaborations. We think in general that's a positive thing. We do agree with you that when that happens, that there needs to be harmonization of reporting requirements and some of the procedural requirements, because it's not always not always easy to get collaborations with different donors underway in a non-burdensome way, but it does provide opportunities at the same time. And then also another thing that USAID wants to do is to increasingly bring in the private sector into these conversations as well, because that is where really the large amounts of money that can have a positive or a negative influence.
If I could comment on it, and maybe I have a cross question back to you. I mean, in the areas that we've been working in, for example, in Vietnam, I see the picture that you're talking about is very complex. There are different donors coming in. Donors are interested. In fact, as the Ag Results program was starting out, one of the big issues was, there's a World Bank project trying to do the same thing, and how do we try and have an impact? But overall, if more actors come in, it will be easier to get to that final goal of reducing GHG and getting to the green growth, because you need all the actors to come in because of the gainers and losers piece in it. So I think you mentioned that you were trying to evaluate that, and I wonder if you're making the point more from the context of how do we evaluate if climate financing or climate investments are actually having an impact. And I can understand from that perspective, it can be hard to sort of tease out or attribute the impact of a specific action. And maybe that's the context in which you're making the comment. I'm not sure. But it's all good. I mean, it's good that people are coming. Some amount of efficiency can definitely be gained by donor coordination, but we just need more people to sort of take action, is my view in any case.
Yeah, I think there's also, I guess I would add to it, and unfortunately, Ellen stepped out, because I know he's going around on these issues with the IFC significantly with regard to how do you really measure impacts, and how can you say this type of performance is happening or not. One of the ways that we have been involved, this is Abt, but this is USAID, has been involved, let's say in Mexico, is putting together a tracking system for performance on the investments that the government, in this case public investments, the government has been making in mitigation and adaptation. And in that, there's a roll-up of a variety of indicators, but they're also very transparent in it. Anybody can go in and see the equations that are used for calculating GHG emission reductions. You can go in and this is it's a model that was based off something that Summernaut was using. We're calling it carbon counts now, but again, it's something where you have to be as transparent as possible. You have to measure performance over time, which is what the government is doing with their line ministries. And one other area, I think, in which to get it less complicated and to get it to the stage where there's standardization, at least sector-wise, and perhaps how they treat some of these impacts, is to involve those ministries who often have some way of, industries in this case too, who have some standard assessment tools of performance. And that's what was happening in Mexico. They were working with the different line ministries such as agriculture, energy, looking at solid waste, looking at transport, and whoever had those responsibilities for those actions and were investing in public reductions where they basically sat together and they said, these are going to be our sets or goals, and then putting them out there. And Mexico has been very transparent about what it's been doing. And I think, in a sense, that's a bit of a standard for the world, is how do you evolve to the point. I know Indonesia has their own evaluation process too, the MER process. So it's a combination of when you do have valuation or verification techniques, you are also putting them out there for other people to see. Hopefully over time there's a bit of a harmonization. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but the idea is that we've come together on a few standards, and certainly with all the different markets going on, mostly voluntary markets going on, there has been a bit of, there's been added complexity too.
Also, USAID and CEADIR have been cooperating in providing a 2-week training course on looking at economics and analysis and planning for climate change mitigation and adaptation. We've done these twice in Washington, primarily for USAID staff. We did one in Mozambique that also included USAID staff, but also some local government officials and other donors. And we hope to be doing more of these in different parts of the world and involving more of our partner counterparts as well.
Okay.
Okay, we have a question, from the webinar audience for Eric. From James Tarrant, to what extent are decision makers using shadow prices to internalize cost and benefits where market or financial prices do not exist?
Yes. Okay, well, I just mentioned the trainings, and we have, there's some sessions that I delivered at the Mozambique training that actually talked about using shadow prices or imputed prices for environment and natural resources and biodiversity. And if anyone wants to email me, I'd be glad to share this with you. You would need, they're on a Google Drive, so you would need to provide a Gmail address. But I'm at ehyman@usaid.gov. Then Bill Ward is also in his methodological work on cost-benefit analysis will be addressing these issues. A lot of the shadow pricing that has been done in the past in cost-benefit analysis had to do with foreign exchange, largely because of very distorted exchange rates that were set by government policies. And that whole era has really changed because the trade distortions that were so common in the 60s and 70s have been greatly reduced. The foreign exchange pricing distortions have been greatly reduced. So that's another important issue to take into account in shadow pricing, because a lot of the literature on cost-benefit analysis has been geared to that kind of shadow pricing and not the shadow pricing for environment and health and other social benefits that we're interested in promoting now.
Okay. We have another question from our live audience. Hang on just a moment.
Good morning. My name is Pablo Torres. I'm a consultant with, most recently with the Climate Investment Funds. I wanted to ask a question relating to the subject of blue carbon, perhaps under CEADIR or under USAID's portfolio, just broadly asking about any economic analysis that have been done referring to the sequestration of CHGs and coastal zones and all the related co-benefits. Would love to hear some insights on any of that work.
Well, blue carbon is a relatively new area, and USAID has not done much in that area yet. It is something we would be interested in working on under the CEADIR project. We have devoted some attention in the coastal zone more to the adaptation side. What are some of the interventions that can be done to reduce the impacts of climate change in vulnerable coastal areas? That's a very important area that USAID is focusing on.
Mm-hmm. There are several USAID projects. I know when we were out in Mozambique, obviously there's the coastal zone, the coastal CCAP project out there, which is looking at the climate change for cities and adaptation actions to 3 or 4 major cities in Mozambique, to coastal areas, to I believe some other folks in the audience are working on blue carbon. I'm sure your company, Mark, had done some work on blue carbon, also for EPA as well, too. So I don't know if you want to talk about any of the blue carbon work, or have you been involved in that?
A little bit about it, but not enough to say.
Okay.
We actually do still have a number of questions from our audience. From Zhaochen Zhang, and it could be for either Eric or Tulika. If the co-benefits are greater than the climate benefits, should the projects be tackled from the other angle or another angle, but take climate change as co-benefits? And he adds that this has many implications: which ministry should initiate the project, which sector the main resources should come from.
That's a very good question, and I think perhaps that's what the two of us are probably trying to say here, that that there can be different hues in which the co-benefits come, and sometimes the co-benefits are the main driver. So if you look at even the example we gave of the transportation project, I mean, the primary reason that's happening is because of all the benefits to society from time saving and so forth, and you get GHG mitigation out of it. And in the case of agriculture, if you're introducing technologies which reduce carbon emissions but also increase incomes, it becomes naturally something that the agriculture sector will want to take on. So in the case of Indonesia too, you see the various types of co-benefits that came in, and one obvious thing that comes into conversation when you're looking at this variety of co-benefits is a multi-sectoral approach to solving these projects or getting financing for these projects. And that's why they use the word called landscape analysis. So when you come to a landscape and you look at various returns that come from various sectors, you may be needing to involve different types of departmental ministries, whether it's health when it's related to a transportation project, or whether it's agriculture when it's related to, in the case of Vietnam and Indonesia. And very readily you start getting Department of Energy involved in it, because there's part of the investments are related to renewable energy projects, which are taking care of deforestation up front, on the upper watersheds, and then generating energy in the downstream. So again, you have two sectors that are involved. So it's a very good question, and again moves, tries to move the conversation to multi-sectoral approaches and coordination among ministries and coordination among donors to tap into the financing.
At USAID, in the Bureau of Food Security, we have a very large Feed the Future program, and there's within the agency there's a large cross-bureau working group on climate-smart agriculture as well.
And even in the context, I would add, in the context of adaptation, or in the context of the Feed the Future's two main targets are poverty reduction and nutrition. And if you wrap in climate adaptation there, then again, the whole multi-sector approach becomes really important.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you sort of come to the suboptimal solutions.
Yeah.
And I know in Mozambique, the Feed the Future program is trying to work through a multi-sectoral strategy to address all of these threats, poverty and adaptation-related impacts on poverty.
Yeah. And we had an executive order in the United States in 2014 directing all federal agencies to consider the effects of climate change on all of their programs, and what adaptation requirements are needed to ensure resilience of those programs.
Another question?
Yeah, from Judy Dellinger. What are some successful public-private partnerships where local firms invested in climate-smart development in their cities or regions in partnership with their local subnational governments?
Well, they're upcoming, at least in MCC. I mean, I think the whole idea is to create partnerships across the private sector, the public sector, and come up with proposals, for example, for developing cocoa and coffee. I would say overall cocoa and coffee investments have been pretty strong from the private sector side. These companies are pretty big, and they are interested in building the value chains. And in so far as that leads to more intensive agriculture and reduces the deforestation because people are not cutting forests, I think that's where, as far as I know, there have been some successes. Want to make one important point is that starting out, I think there was the hope that they could have a completely commercial window where the private sector entities come in with other private actors to submit proposal, but it seemed like they always needed to have some broader public sector partnerships to make that the full proposal, or for it to all make sense for all parties involved.
Yeah.
So I think that's it's a good question, and I think that perhaps with a little bit of research we can come up with some more interesting answers. But for now, that's what I have.
Yeah, USAID has been supporting a lot of sustainable tree crop programming in Africa and also in Latin America. I'm not sure to what extent the subnational governments have been involved, particularly in smaller countries where there are not decentralized governmental structures as there are in Indonesia that have a lot of power now.
I think also the Tropical Alliance that you were talking 2020, I don't know whether you can say some more about some of the companies involved in that too. But that's exactly part of the idea is achieving success.
Yeah, I don't want to mention particular companies, but there is you can check them on the web when you search Tropical Forest Alliance 2020 to see the full list of countries and other partners.
Okay. A question from Katrine Heron. What about the multiple benefit concept that goes beyond the co-benefits? If, for example, there are several major benefits resulting from mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity protection.
Yeah, we basically, under the broad rubric of the term co-benefits, really talking about multiple benefits, and we would always want to include multiple benefits to the extent possible.
But I think that in terms of attracting climate financing, the point is which of those are the ones that are going to be, that can be leveraged easily for climate financing, which benefits accrue to which entities, and which entities will come up and probably become partners in moving the project forward. So that piece is important, and when you're looking at the multiple benefits.
Okay. A question from Carlos Hasman. There is a strong global tendency to change the management scheme of important ecosystems once managed entirely by the government to an increased participation of local communities through right-based, access-based mechanisms. Are there studies done on which management scheme, community, private sector, government, a mixture, would provide larger co-benefits and ensure larger global economic gains, biodiversity conservation, and GHG reduction?
USAID has been a strong proponent of community-based natural resource projects in forestry and other areas as well. There have been a number of evaluations that have been done on some of these programs, and again, if you contact me, I can send you some literature that USAID has supported in the past in these areas.
Judy Dellinger, again, had a question for Tulika about ag results, that it's a results-based incentive, and participants would get the funding at the end of their project once they show results. Was that really feasible? Could the smallholders pre-finance their production, be able to wait until the end of the production season? That seems atypical in many countries.
Thanks for that question. Actually, the results-based incentives program, there are, just to say that it's beyond Vietnam, it has many other components. And the most interesting piece of the puzzle of bringing together such a program is to figure out who should the incentive be directed to. Typically, the incentives are directed to the final private actor player who should be providing those services, or the area where the market actually fails. So in the case of Vietnam, it's not the smallholder who will get the incentive. It's the person who can aggregate the smallholder who would get the incentives, or the incentives could even be given to exporters if you think that that is going to be a sort of a big enough pull, so to speak, to make the entire value chain work. So the smallholders will, the way that is played out, for example, in Kenya, where pull mechanisms are being used under ag results to motivate the adoption of off-farm storage, the incentives are given to the manufacturers themselves. The manufacturers may decide to, because they have deep pockets, decide to give up-ahead financing to the smallholder to increase the adoption, and so they can pay back later. So they leave it to the market to sort out, or they leave out to the entity who's getting the incentive to sort out how to then incentivize the smallholder. In the case of Nigeria, where the incentives are designed to increase the adoption of aflasafe, which limits the impact of aflatoxins, the aggregators get the incentives, and the aggregators basically give upfront credit financing to smallholders so that they can adopt it. So it does not become a burden on smallholder at all. It requires an initial value chain analysis and assessment of where the pivotal entity is who should get the incentives. And there is some conversation going on in the case of Vietnam whether it should be the exporters of rice who should get the incentives, or should it be merely anybody or any entity who could organize farmers, which could be NGOs or other actors.
Okay. Another question from Zhaochen Zhang. How many developing countries have the capacity to conduct such analysis by themselves? How much more expensive is it for the country to include co-benefit analysis to get the same amount of climate finance, e.g. the Vietnam program, and are you aware of such studies?
Well, yeah, many country governments do need technical assistance. That's one of the reasons why we're supporting the CEADIR program. In terms of the financing question, it depends on the sources of the financing as to what degree of interest they have in co-benefits versus the climate mitigation direct benefits. But for some of them, it will be very important to document and not just to identify them in advance and analyze them in advance, but also to monitor that they're actually happening over time, particularly when you're dealing with REDD+ programs, reducing emissions from forest deforestation and forest degradation, and to ensure that you're not getting displacement effects where you're getting more deforestation somewhere else because you're saving a little patch of forest in one area.
If I could also just add to that in terms of either building capacity or assessing the developing country's own capacity to do this. Programs like CEADIR, for example, can also help in creating the basic knowledge base that will be needed to make these analyses simpler going forward. In many instances, you can apply benefit transfer approaches, so conducting detailed literature review, as we did in the case of Indonesia, keeping all of those data sources in one place, having these estimates readily available, can give you some sense of where the big co-benefits are. Sometimes you don't need to do a whole lot of very expensive analysis to just give the indication of where the benefits are and where you can invest the resources to do something bigger, or just use that as a benchmark lower bound estimate to move towards climate action and policy planning. And I'm a big proponent of sort of, coming up with some of this quick analysis using existing work and existing data to get the right policy action. And hopefully we can in CEADIR generate, all the information in a way that can be used more readily by other countries.
Yeah, we are one of the outputs that CEADIR will be working on is a toolkit for attracting private sector financing for both mitigation and adaptation and climate change.
It seems like a good idea.
And this follows a previous output that the ALEG project had, which was a toolkit for banks that were considering financing small and medium enterprises in clean energy.
Okay, I think we'll wrap up at this point. We're coming to the end of the session, but I wanted to thank everybody. I particularly want to thank Crown Agents for hosting it, as usual here, and for their involvement. I also want to thank the people who have come out. And please, next month, I think it will be June 9th is our next series, and we'll be talking, one of our colleagues from the CEADIR team, Elias Epstein, will be moderating the session on looking at green bonds and financing too. And again, one of the very interesting aspects that we're finding is that there's been a significant increase in, I think just this last week, those of us who track green bonds and talk about new financial instruments or emerging financial instruments. we've seen an incredible uptick from India, from China, and from a variety of other countries in looking into and creating green bonds for climate financing too. So just want to give a little bit of a pitch to the next session, and thank you very much, Eric and Tulika, for your conversation. Anybody who's interested, please come up and talk with them, and or if you're on the webinar, you can always send in the last slide and everything too, their email addresses where you can try to contact us and ask some more questions, and we will be responding to those. Thank you very much.